And so even though Peter is writing to people that are living in the era of the Roman Empire, a lot of these things have relevance to us today, right? There's applicable principles that we can pull into modern society, even though we don't have masters and slaves in this country to the same way.
On that memory verse, I didn't analyze that up and down in the scriptures. What was he really talking about there? Because we all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, but he says that fervent love for one another will cover a multitude of sins. I think that's a good statement about God and about Christ. But when we talk about multitude of sins for me, if I love, love in my heart that my sins, multitude of sins.
I'm just looking, because this memory verse is actually not from the part that we've been studying all week, and so I guess I hadn't really, no, that's a good point though, Bob. I hadn't really delved into that and reading the context of it. You hear it quoted and thrown out there a lot of times that, oh, love covers a multitude of sins.
That's right.
But in a true, I think what you're asking is, what does that mean in a theological sense? What is it truly?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
One of all my sins
Yeah, that's right.
So are we talking maybe Christ's love on the cross is what covers a multitude of sins?
Well, I know that's true.
Because if we,
No, but here's part of it. It says, above all things, have fervent love for one another.
but you got to back up because he's obviously been listing other things, and then he says above all. So you kind of got to see what's the context. What were you going to say, Crystal?
The source of love is God. God is love. And so if we love,
And like, you know, I know Sean Boonstra pointed out several times in the meetings that, you know, chapter delineations were arbitrarily added in later, and so sometimes the thought process that's going on doesn't start with verse 1 in that chapter necessarily. It might be continued on from previously. So, you know, I'm just trying to look at where to like back up to.
That's all right. I was not trying to get along.
Get us on it, yeah.
I read that and I thought to myself, boy, is that covering my sins or the person I'm loving?
Maybe what it's just a thought that's coming to me now is maybe it's, when it's saying a covering a multitude of sins is not necessarily that in the sense of, if we're going to use it on a level of us to each other, is what I'm looking at right now, thinking, you know, because it's saying love one another, because our love covers a multitude of sins.
You know, I just thought
And I was, just a second, Bob, I was thinking maybe it's meaning that when we love someone as Christ loves us, when we love each other with that same kind of love, that we don't notice I'm not going to notice your little flaws and your little faults, and I'm not going to care about them because I love you.
that's basically what
And I think that's really what it's saying. You know, I don't know if the original Greek, to go back and look at it.
sin can't exist within God's love.
Right.
But I think you had the point there, and that's what I was going to try to get to. You said it much better than I would have. But even within a marriage, we get offended, like the pastor says, or something said that bugs you. That may not be a sin, but that's,
Irritations.
Yeah.
We could substitute
but if you
multitude
love
of
each other
irritations,
enough, it will cover that.
multitude of flaws,
that's
multitude of just being human, right? But if we have that love for one another, it smooths things over a lot. That we'd have to really get into it and to and maybe understand the original Greek to know for sure if that's the right, but it sounds like in the context that that's maybe
I'll
what.
ask the Lord when I get to heaven.
That's right, that's right.
Know the Greek.
So let's look at, let's back up to 1 Peter 2, which is where most of the lesson takes place. And verses 13 to 17 is on Sunday's lesson. If somebody wants to read that out loud. 1 Peter 2, 13 to 17, is there anyone volunteer?
Therefore submit yourselves in every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it to the kings as supreme, or the governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to the silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king.
Okay. So it's really talking about our relationship to government, right? To authority over us, to the king. In some places back in those days, it was oftentimes a king that was there, or an emperor, or Caesar, or someone that would have been, in our case, it's a president, or, governor of the state, whatever it might be. Do we always agree with what the person in the political office is doing?
Should better ask, do we ever agree?
And I'm not wanting to open any political discussion right now. We are talking in terms of principles right now. We are not talking about a person, okay?
What it is we have to respect the office that was set up,
Exactly.
and that is what it is. And that we may not like what that person is doing, but we need to respect the office that
Right,
they've been put in.
right. And so they, as governor or president or leader over the country, have authority, right? And God is saying, honor that authority of your leaders, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with them or not. I mean, Peter's talking at a time when, like the lesson points out, the pagan Roman Empire was in full sway and doing things like crucifying people on crosses and really, they had a good legal system, I guess. You actually could be heard in a court of law, and they followed, Roman. I mean, that is evident with like Paul. When Paul was, they knew he was a Roman citizen, then he had certain rights that he, couldn't just be arbitrarily, imprisoned without a cause or without whatever. So they had a structure, and they had it, whether you liked it or not, but they were the government that was in power. And they weren't all loving and kind and understanding. And yet, Peter's saying, honor them, respect them, right? So, any other comments? Anybody have anything else on? The question at the bottom of Sunday's lesson, I think, is good for us to bring it into relevance also as Christians. It says here, why is it important for Christians to be as good citizens as possible, even in less than ideal political situations? Any ideas? Any comments?
Just to try to show an example to others.
Okay. And who are we? What does the title Christian mean? Who are we representing? Christ, right? I mean, if a Democrat says they're a Democrat, they're representing that party, aren't they? A Republican representing that party. If we say we're Christian, we're representing Christ, right? So when you claim a title or a membership of some kind, you're representing that organization or that ideology or whatever, right? Yes, Crystal.
And God has a plan, and we don't know what God's plan is for He's going to move them around
Right.
into His will.
Because elsewhere, and I can never remember where these texts are, I read them, but that we all probably familiar with the text where, God sets up and takes down kingdoms, right? The Bible tells us he's in control, he knows who it is, and whether he agrees with what the person in power is doing, he is ultimately, they are not allowed to actually do anything that doesn't ultimately fulfill his will, right? So they might do something that we don't like or that makes us suffer, and yet God's able to turn that into his long-range plan, and it all works out, right? So, but I think this question at the bottom of the Sunday's lesson is saying we're representing God. So we should be good citizens. We should be law-abiding citizens, right? Whether we think the law is fair and just, whether we agree with it, we should be law-abiding, because if we aren't, how are we smearing the name of God, really, right?
I think too, Dr. DeRose, it was excellent that he did, that we're being called to obedience through this whole thing. We go back through and really kind of summarize, what the first chapter, the second chapter and stuff, that we're really calling us, he's writing this, and calling us to obedience. Mm-hmm. And it's always, this is, putting Christ, and then this is, there's balance, this balance that goes between what Christ did and what we should be doing. Mm-hmm. And he also says then that what Jesus has done for us, and we are called to be as Christians. Mm-hmm. So we have to think in that way. If we really do need to think about the fact that he didn't open his mouth when he went to the cross for us. Mm-hmm. But then also you see where Paul and you see Peter, how they bring this balance in, that you go with, like all the different texts are there about the money that came out, who do you pay
right.
Caesar to. But when it comes to when they were told that they weren't supposed to preach, I think it was John.
Right, and we're jumping ahead. I think that's like Thursdays, Wednesday or Thursdays. But no, you're right. We'll get to that.
God first.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
In this
yes,
lesson
Bob.
that you're talking about Sunday,
Okay.
I like this little statement here. The Roman government was not fun. It wasn't fun, but listen to this, and we can think of our own government, because some of the things that are going on in Washington, D.C., you can't believe, on both parties.
Right.
In fact, for all its faults, the Roman Empire provided stability. It brought freedom from war. It distributed a harsh justice, but a justice based, nevertheless, on the rule of the law. It built roads, established monetary systems to support the military needs. In doing so, Rome created an environment in which the population was able to grow and in many cases prosper. Mm-hmm. So
it created that stability. It had a system, whether you always liked its system or not,
right.
but it was a system that worked and at that time. Jasmine, you had your hand up.
That's a
We're
good
talking
point.
about Christianity
thank
Mm-hmm.
you.
still, and I just want to share.
Oh, okay.
It says here that we, as a Christian, we represent just to have a Jesus sticker on our cars and a cross hanging around our necks. I don't know. Saying our Christianity, we must have the fruit to back it up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it says here the power thought, I represent God with my words and actions. My life bears good fruit. That's my
Right. And people are watching. And so if we are seen as good citizens, that's true in terms of Christianity. It's applicable to people just desiring Christ when they see us as good Christians. But in the context of today's lesson, if they see us as good citizens, if your neighbors know that you're just always an honest, good person, you abide by the laws, you don't, if there's some city ordinance that says you're not allowed to have, chickens in your backyard, you're not going to have, just little things, but they see that you're abiding by the laws. It's a testimony to, if anybody else slanders, well, so-and-so, whatever, and they'll say, well, yeah, but they're good people. They've been next to me for all these years. They're good, honest people. We want to be representing Christ in every way, right? So let's move on to Monday's lesson. And And it's talking about masters and slaves, but we want to pull that into today's context and say, how does that apply to maybe the boss you don't like, whatever. So let's look at 1 Peter 2, 18 to 23, if someone else wants to carry on and continue reading. 18 to 23.
Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable, if because of conscience towards God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. Which, is that the end of it? Or?
Up until 23, it says, yeah.
Who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously.
Okay. So it starts off talking about servants, but then it pulls it into Jesus' example of suffering unfairly, unjustly, but he bore it, right? And he didn't. It says, when he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to God, who judges righteously. So, any thoughts or comments about how we apply that to today, to our workplaces, to our bosses or managers, or?
It's like we're practicing obedience, practicing enduring suffering, and we do it for Him. And so when the time comes, we'll be ready.
Right. So it's kind of a test or trial to, Jasmine, he's waving, it's back there, I guess. Oh, it's way back on the back pew, Jasmine, way over there, yeah. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. You were saying, yeah, the testing, the trying, like it is preparing us for when maybe we are tested or tried in a spiritual way, in an unfair way, right? Where we might be reviled for Jesus' sake, where we might be unfairly persecuted, whatever, for just standing up for God. And as Crystal's pointing out, that maybe that learning to be obedient, learning to be submissive, and enduring it with that Christian attitude in our common everyday workplace situation is teaching us to be ready for those bigger tests. I think, is that what you were saying? Yeah. Caddy, did you have your hand up?
Well, you know, it's amazing when you really look at the ethics in the workplace too, you know, and then think about what you as a Christian need to be doing, because there is so much theft, even in time, like not getting your work done when you should be doing it, and then put in for overtime. You know, taking whether it's rulers or pencils or whatever, you know, and take them home for yourself. Those are costs to your, employer. You know, we have to look at, you know, what we are representing, that we look at it from that standpoint too. We're not entitled to those
Right,
things.
right.
You know,
And that's
and working as hard as you can and the best that you can do.
right. And that's all valid. Your points are very valid. I agree with them. But in the context of this lesson, it's talking about unfair treatment. So so maybe we're doing our job. We're doing the best we can, and we have some coworker who's slacking, and they know how to suck up to the boss and make it look like we're the ones that weren't doing our job, right? Or we can probably, we've all been in those kind of situations where we can probably think of examples of where maybe we were misunderstood or misjudged or unfairly disciplined or, written up for something that we know wasn't really fair. Maybe somebody else framed us for it, another coworker trying to cover themselves. And how those are those tests, like Crystal was just saying. How do we conduct ourselves? Candy?
Well, that happened, I'd had an injury at work, and they put me in the staffing office, and I had to call to see if other nurses could come in. And when I got an answer machine, I would hang up and I would say, well, God bless, have a wonderful day, and I would hang up. And one of the girls in the other staffing office reported me, so the supervisor came in and they said, Candy, we understand that you're saying God bless on the phone, and that might be offensive. I said, well then, I said, do you want to write me up? And she says, oh, no. I said, well, would you like to fire me then? And she goes, no, we know how you are, you know. So it's the fact that we need, if that should not be offensive, but you don't want to be offensive, like we're talking about today, but you can be in trouble for standing up for your faith. And another girl had a cross on her desk, and a Jewish woman came in and said, that's offensive to me, yet she wore a Star of David. You know, so there are things that you're going to have to believe.
Yeah. And you know, not to, maybe I shouldn't go down that path of start another can of worms, but it's actually been in the news recently about how Christians are being persecuted more and more around the world. This is on Fox News, I read on, online, that there's a recognition in media and whatever that Christians are under attack. And yes.
I explained to Candy earlier, my kids' school, they started this year a new thing, they don't do the Pledge of Allegiance no more.
Because it has the word God in the name of God.
I mean, that's something that we've done ever since that school
Sure.
started.
Sure.
But they said they did it last year, but they stopped doing it this year because they have more Muslim kids coming in.
Yeah.
We used to have prayer in school when I was growing up.
Yeah.
That's what my mom said.
Yeah. In the teachers' helps, there's a couple of extra things here. It says, after discussing submission to authority in general, especially civil authority, Peter turns to the issue of servant-master relationships, which speaks to modern employer-employee relationships. The term doulos includes a variety of servant or slave functions, but most commonly refers to an individual working to pay off a debt. In any case, the doulos owed loyalty, respect, and faithful service to the master for whom he or she worked. Excuse me. What the master was due was based not on how well the servant was treated, but on the authority of the master and on the responsibility of the servant to submit to that authority. Submitting, despite harsh treatment, was considered commendable because it showed a consciousness of God as the ultimate master of authority. Then there's a question here that says, what effect will my relationship with my employer have on those who are observing my daily conduct as a believer? Here we come back to that representing God thing, right? People are watching us, aren't they? I can remember years ago being in a workplace where I never had to say a word about that I didn't drink, but I was working, I was young, single, and there was lots and lots of us young single nurses at this one hospital in the New York City area. And at the time, there was just a nursing shortage, and they were bringing in tons of nurses from Ireland and the Philippines, and they were all just like fresh off the plane working in American hospitals. And all these young Irish nurses were loved. If they had a Friday night off, they were partying, and it was a teaching hospital, so they would. The doctors would go on rounds, their teaching rounds. They'd have all the residents come around on rounds and stuff, and so they would use that terminology and talk about, oh, hey, you're going to meet us Friday night for liver rounds. They were talking about going out to drink. But they would refer to them as liver rounds. Knowing that the alcohol was hurting their livers, they would just make a joke about it. But they would always be going off, partying over and over. And they'd ask everybody in the circle, but they never turned and asked me, like, hey, Lori, you going to come with us?
Did you get offended?
No. But I mean, it's like, how do they know I didn't drink? But people watch you. They know from the things you say. They know, I mean, it's just like if someone knows, if they're swearing and they know you're a Christian or whatever, they might kind of like, oops, I'm sorry. You know, there's, people are watching. And so if we have a relationship with our employer where others see us, even when we're maybe wrongly treated, our coworker sees us get reprimanded by the boss or given extra work to do more than somebody else or whatever it is, and yet we do it without complaining, we're not murmuring, we're not, bad-mouthing the boss, whatever. They're observing our character, aren't they? They're observing who we as a Christian are, maybe different than other people. And I thought that was interesting, just to think about our conduct, our relationship with our boss, and how other people are looking at that. And then it says, talking about the example of Jesus, because Peter goes into that, so when Jesus was reviled and when he was doing all these things, he didn't fight back. He said, Peter insists that those of his readers who have endured suffering for doing good have been called to follow in the example of Christ, who suffered for them while doing good. He committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth, 1 Peter 2:22. Peter here quotes from Isaiah 53:9 as evidence that Christ was doing good, adding, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. That's from the NIV. Then Peter borrows again from the messianic prophecy in Isaiah 53, concluding in verse 24 of his epistle, he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. The substitutionary sacrifice that Jesus made for us places on us an obligation to behave with humility as he did and with readiness to suffer for doing what is right. Peter's rationale in 1 Peter 2:25 explains that although in the past we were like sheep going astray, that we now have returned to the shepherd and overseer of our souls, and we have an obligation to follow in his steps, just as sheep do when they have meaningful relationships with the shepherd. So Jesus' example of suffering when he was unfairly treated, but bearing it without mouthing back. I mean, when you think of him in Pilate's hall, the mockery and the spitting on him and the hitting him and he's God. And these people, he could have just spoken a word and they would have dropped over, fallen down, fainted, died, whatever. I mean, he could have just given them a look that would have wilted them, and yet he just bore it. And that's he's our example, right? And it's tough. It's hard, to bear things when it's unfair. You're like, I'm a person gets worked up over things that aren't fair. I'm like, but that's not fair. I want justice. I'm like, okay, Lord, So there's a personal application I need to remember here. Let's look at Tuesday. Wives and husbands. This is dangerous. My husband is sitting in this class here. 1 Peter 3, verses 1-7. Somebody have that and want to read that? Everybody's. Chapter 3, verse 1-7.
Oh, 1-7. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. When they see the purity and reverence in your lives, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and wearing of gold and jewelry and fine clothing. Rather, it should be that of inner self, unfading beauty, of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way of the holy women of the past, who put their hope in God. use to adorn themselves. They submit themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are the daughters if you are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give your way to fear, give your way to fear.
In verse 7?
Did you ladies hear all that?
Yeah. Verse 7?
Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as if you live with your wives. Treat them with respect as a weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers.
Okay. So we can all probably think of ways that these words have been misapplied over the years, but it's important to look in the context also. In verse 1, he's saying, wives, likewise submissive to your husband. I liked your version. What version of the Bible is that?
NIV.
Oh, it was NIV. It had a nice way of expressing a lot of the thoughts. But it says, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some who do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. So it's putting this in the context of, be such a Christian and respectful to your husband so that even if he's not a believer, he's going to be won over. You don't have to preach to him. It says without a word. But just your actions, your behavior, your gentleness, your sweetness, your meekness, whatever, your respect that you show to your husband, he's going to be convinced, of the truth just by observing you. What I found was really interesting, because when you don't read and understand the original language, sometimes you miss some things. And in verse 7, it talks about, in the New King James, it refers to the wife as the weaker vessel. And that term in the original language is, a vessel was a clay, something that was, handcrafted kind of thing. And it says, the expression weaker vessel in verse 7 of some translations does not refer to physical or emotional weakness. I've always thought it was just referring to, men tend to be stronger, women are more delicate and, and not as strong, and so men should treat them more gently and, don't roughhouse with them the way they might with their buddies, or, just to be respectful of a woman's frailer physical. But that's not what it's talking about here. It says it refers to finely made dishware. Very likely it is a reference to how men should treat women, behaving toward them as they would a valuable piece of china, which should be handled with great care and regard lest it be broken needlessly. The expression is a positive assessment of the value of the wife and is considerate and the considerate and gentle manner in which she should be treated. How do we assess the value of women in our lives? So I thought it was just a little different. I mean, it's still saying that she's more fragile and more delicate, right? But it's also saying that she's so precious and valuable. This is like your fine china. You're not going to, if your kid is setting the table, you're going to be like, hold that carefully. Don't clink the dishes together. Don't, and there's a implied value there that the husband should. So let's look at that verse again. It says, husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife, so that's showing value to her, right? As to the weaker vessel, or the more delicate china. As
The little statement at the end is quite interesting.
that your prayers may not be hindered. Yes. So in other words, it's not, guys can't just be off the hook to say, well, she didn't honor me. She didn't this and that, so that meant it was okay for me to smack her. Or it was okay for me to speak harsh words to her. Or it was okay for me to whatever, because somehow they feel like, hey, God said we're supposed to, wives are supposed to honor the husband. Toe the line, woman. But God's saying, hey, or Peter's saying here, if you aren't showing her that same kind of honor and treating her as this delicate, valuable, vessel, your prayers to God might be hindered. God's not going to pay as much attention to your hypocrisy, basically, is what it's saying, right? Why would our prayers to God be hindered? I mean, God loves us. He hears our prayers, doesn't he? What's going to hinder our prayer?
How we treat people, and he loves us, but doesn't make him proud
Right.
of us sometimes.
But isn't there some level of hypocrisy, some level of insincerity? If we are saying with one thing, oh God, we think of like the Pharisees, the example of the publican praying to God and the Pharisees praying to God, and Jesus, right in the Gospels, where they were so self-righteous, right? They were keeping all those laws and all those rules, and they were sure that they had a shoe into heaven, and they're strutting their stuff around, and God is saying, no, that's not the way you worship me. And so, it's not enough for us to just mouth the words that we love God or that we are Christian or whatever. It's our behavior also. So I think our prayers being hindered it means simply God is only limited by our attitudes and our behavior, right? It's not, I don't know, I think that's how I look at it as,
Even though you might be saved, because if you love me, proclaim that you love me, you will be in the kingdom of heaven. I mean, that's a simple thing.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean there's not consequences for your sin down here on this earth. Prayers may not be answered at that particular time.
okay.
I don't think equal thing in marriage. Thank you. I was trying to think of that word. And after 61 years, I know it more than ever before.
All right.
Carol just cuffs me around once in
Instead of every day.
a while.
She's trained you well, huh? Let's look at Wednesday and Thursday quickly in the short time that we have left here. On Wednesday, we jump to some of Paul's writings, which, as we read them, you'll see are very parallel to some of what we've just read of what Peter wrote. And so let's, if we can have different ones turn to, somebody take Romans 13, 1-7. We might not have time to read the whole thing, but Ephesians 5, 22, 23, 1 Corinthians 7, 12-16, and Galatians 3, 27, 28. Let's just quickly see. So, does anybody have Romans 13?
Let every soul be subject unto the higher power, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisted their power, resisted the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. 13.
Well, I mean, I think we're going to just need to kind of summarize some of these. So that's probably enough to show, here's Paul saying, submit yourself to authorities, right? And because, just a lot of the same things, that the reason they punish is when you're wrong, they punish you, and it's kind of paralleling a lot of what Peter had said. And then Ephesians 5, 22 and 23. Anybody got that? Okay, so a more condensed version of what Peter wrote, but same thing. Wives, submit yourself to your husband. Husband's ahead of the wife as Christ is head of the church. 1 Corinthians 7, 12-16. Anybody got that? 1 Corinthians 7. This one is about the believing spouse and the unbelieving spouse and staying with them. So, that they may win your spouse through your witness, basically, same kind of thing. So Paul's got those pieces in two different places where Peter had it all in one passage, but it's the same concept. Galatians 3:27-28. For as many as you were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So it says, how does what Paul says compare to what Peter says in some of those passages that we read? That's pretty comparable, I think, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of parallels there. And it says that towards the bottom of Wednesday's lesson, it says, Paul then was willing to work within legally mandated cultural boundaries. He understood what could be changed about his culture and what could not. Yet he also saw something within Christianity that would end up transforming the way society thinks about people. Just as Jesus didn't seek to bring about any kind of political revolution in order to change the social order, neither did Peter or Paul. Change could come instead by the leavening influence of godly people in their society. So there's a lot of emphasis nowadays, especially in the younger generation, on social activism. People are really speaking out again about things like racism and about things like, discrimination and whatever. There's a lot of people really getting worked up on that and demonstrating on those things and whatnot. And that's popular right now in many circles. But we as Christians want to be careful on how we conduct ourselves in our goals of changing society, right? We want to be, we're not going to be those that go down the street rioting and breaking windows and throwing rocks and whatever because we're trying to make a point on something that we're, I think that what we've read today, in the Bible, is that we're to, conduct ourselves in such an exemplary manner as citizens, as neighbors, as employees, or whatever, that through our influence, through, prayer and bringing those things to God, that we can be that positive leavening influence in society, right? Anybody have any comments on that?
Like they're trying to make something right, because something matters, but they're skewing.
Right. And so I think that's right, and that's what I think the lesson is saying is we want to bring about social change. We see things in society that are wrong, but if I am upset with how another race is being treated, I can set the example by going to those people and showing love and kindness to them, right? And just going out of my way to, I think, people, you see some of these positive things too now where there's all this, hatred against cops or whatever, and people taking the time to just stop their car and get out and go give a police officer a hug or bring them some food or some. Right, but just people feeling like, I want to show support, I want to show, we can do those kind of things as Christians, right? And we can do those kind of things, so whether it's concerns about racism, about our African American brothers and sisters, or whatever it is, we can demonstrate that love. We can demonstrate that love by looking around us. If we have someone of that ethnicity in our neighborhood, inviting them over at your backyard barbecue, getting to know them, getting to build relationships with those. And we are helping to heal our neighborhood or our society around us, right, by demonstrating that. And I think that's what the point the lesson is making. All right, well, we are almost out of time. Thursday talks about Acts 5, 27 to 32 is, let's see. I don't remember how it goes. Okay, so where Peter and other apostles were commanded not to preach anymore, right? The authorities were here. They'd already put Jesus to death. They've already, endured the rumors of his resurrection and all this kind of stuff. And now the Christians are spreading this, these stories, as they thought of them, as like wildfire. And it was a threat to the status quo or to their power and their authority, right? And so they're commanding the apostles, do not preach anymore in this name. They would threaten them, they would flog them, whatever, and then release them and say, don't ever do this again. And here Peter and Paul both tell us to obey authority, submit to authority, and we're out of time here, so we can't get into this in depth. But just, what is the difference? What is the bottom line difference here? God's first, right? So Peter answers in verse 29, we ought to obey God rather than man. So God is telling us, submit to authority always, up to the point where it conflicts with what God has told us to do, right? And God has told us to preach the gospel to every nation. And so they couldn't keep quiet. They couldn't restrict that because they had to obey God. So those are the times when, Yeah, those are the exceptions to our obeying government, right? We're out of time. Let's bow our heads. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for these lessons, these examples that you have set for us and the way you conducted yourself on this earth. Lord, we want to be model citizens in society, but we also want to be model citizens for heaven. And we just ask that you will help us each day to submit our lives to you, to be able to represent you, even if it means turning our other cheek sometimes. We thank you for your promise to be with us and ask that you'll be with us throughout this coming week. In your name, amen.